From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights Podcast.
Welcome to HPS Insights, a podcast from Hamilton Place Strategies, analyzing the current events impacting the business and political communities. I'm your host, Brian DeAngelis, and today I'm teaming up with one of my colleagues, Elliot Owensby, to discuss Thursday's Judiciary Committee markup of Senator Klobuchar and Senator Grassley's American Innovation and Choice Online Act. Elliot and several others at HPS have been tracking this legislation and Congress's interest in competition policy, specifically targeting quote unquote big tech. And he's working closely with others in the space concerned about some of these impacts that these proposals may have on consumers. So Elliot, thanks for coming on. Let me hand it over to you to give us a little rundown and a brief introduction of our guest today.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Well, I think obviously as the debate around all things antitrust and competition policy, and specifically big tech, continues to, I would say evolve, but certainly continue in the U.S. and in D.C. It's great to have Adam Kovacevic with us from the Chamber of Progress. Adam, if I can take it in reverse chronological order, first became an advocate in undergrad, bringing grapes back to the dining hall, which I personally appreciate as a Fresno County kid. Adam, you spent some time with Sheriff Dooley and the New Democrats and Senator Lieberman before you were at Google, and working on all the things that came before the policy shop, including certainly issues with the FTC, with broader engagement with policymakers. You spent a stint at Lime, and now here we are, without further ado, with the Chamber of Progress, which is a center-left advocacy organization dedicated to making sure folks understand the good parts of technology, which is something I want to get to today, because I think that's a little maybe not as prominent in the conversation, I think, as it should be when we come to some of the impacts that these things may have. So Adam, first of all, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Very kind introduction too.
So maybe just to start with a little bit of kind of the state of play. So last Thursday, in a relatively brief 4-hour markup, I think by Senate standards and by markup standards, certainly compared to what we saw in the House over the summer, the full Senate Judiciary Committee marked up the legislation Brian mentioned from the lead sponsors, from Senator Klobuchar and Senator Grassley. And I think just by way of brief background, the primary thrust, I would argue, of the proposal is related to this definition of what a covered platform is, if you will. Essentially, the platforms or businesses that would be subject to this new level of scrutiny and these additional criteria around what they can and cannot do, primarily related to the products and services that may interact with the platform in some way. I realize that sounds vague if you're not paying close attention, but that is essentially pretty much what we do know at this juncture. And then the process, coming out of markup, I think obviously in DC, markups get a lot of attention, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything to most people. Basically it's a kind of a class debate over the proposal in front of the committee. And then from there, it's a relatively complex process to eventually come to a full vote before the Senate and then kind of continue through the legislative process. I think just lastly, I'd say that what we heard from really bipartisan group of senators on Thursday is a concern with how this process has unfolded so far, with relatively little kind of substantial debate or kind of that public hearing maybe that most people are familiar with when Congress is working through some of these big issues. So with all of that, I think that's my quick version of where we are now, and I think we can kind of jump in on some of these things. Maybe, Adam, the place to start is just kind of high level. What was your reaction to Thursday, and what kind of stood out to you on that discussion?
I think what stood out to me was that it was actually a pretty good debate over what was being proposed and what was at stake, and frankly, what the pros and cons of that approach are. So, as you mentioned in brief, the bill by Senator Klobuchar would prohibit the 5 big tech companies, Amazon, Apple, Google, Meta, and Microsoft. Potentially, they've added TikTok, potentially WeChat, from preferencing their own products over those of competitors. So our view is that would likely prohibit, for example, Amazon from featuring its Amazon Basics brand. Amazon couldn't highlight its Amazon Prime 2-day shipped products. A new iPhone probably couldn't come pre-installed with iMessage or FaceTime or the Apple App Store. And I think you heard Senator Klobuchar during the hearing explain why she thinks this is a good idea, because her belief is that big tech services have crowded out services like Yelp and Spotify and made it harder for their services to reach customers. And we've seen those complaints for years. On the other hand, you had senators like Senator Feinstein, Padilla, Leahy, Coons all voice reservations about that approach on a variety of concerns, going from privacy to security to competitiveness, including convenience. You had this moment where Senator Padilla from California said, look, consumers like that they can go to Amazon or Google, search for a restaurant or a product, and within a few clicks, it's theirs. It's not clear to me that preferencing is a problem, or at least a top concern. In many cases, it yields convenience. So you had, I think, in the committee meeting last week, these two opposing viewpoints being aired in, frankly, a substantive way. And in Congress, I think senators sort of facing the potential consequences of a ban on self-preferencing, what that would mean.
Elliot, Adam, it did strike me as someone who follows this generally, but is not in the weeds, that if you, like me, are not paying close attention, you see a 16-6 vote and you think, okay, this thing's marching straight to the floor. But as Elliot mentioned a second ago, markups can tell us a lot about what's coming up. And given what you just raised, Adam, and some of what I read in terms of concerns, even for those who voted for, we seem a long way off from getting anywhere towards a floor vote.
I think you see, it was really interesting if you've been following this issue closely to see the difference between the way the House operates and the Senate operates. Both the House and the Senate Judiciary Committees, and there's a House version of this bill, have a pretty strong custom of deference to the leaders of the committee and the leaders of the subcommittee. And so there's not a lot of same party amending of bills in committees. So for example, if Democrats hold the committee, a bill is being considered by one of the Democratic subcommittee chair, not a lot of other Democrats are going to amend it. Now, in the House debate we had last June, there were actually a number of Democratic amendments, particularly offered by Congresswoman Lofgren. In the Senate, there were no Democratic amendments. There were 70 plus Republican amendments, most of which were withdrawn. But so on I think you have to look at these things almost from kind of like you're sort of analyzing like what happened between the lines. Was there a committee vote to vote out the bill? Absolutely. But when you have 4 Democrats on the committee saying, I'm going to vote for it, but this bill needs to change a lot, what they're basically saying is it's not ready for the floor. And I'm going to give you the courtesy, Senator Klobuchar, of not airing all of my substantive concerns through amendment, but this needs work. And you frankly saw this, that happen on the Republican side as well. So I do think that you had Senator Grassley, who's, kind of a noted straight shooter, say during the markup that like this bill isn't ready to attract the necessary 60 votes. He's kind of a traditionalist in the sense of I think he'd like to see that improvement happen through a markup. But I think what you saw happening instead over the course of the markup was more and more senators were basically saying, I'm going to express my concerns, signal to the bill sponsors that this thing needs a lot of work post markup, rather than kind of air all of the substantive dirty laundry and force votes on amendments.
I think that's the other thing that stands out to me. And Adam, I may be stealing this from you. I can't remember if this was a point I saw from you on Twitter, actually. But, it only gets more conservative within the Democratic caucus as you go beyond the Judiciary Committee, right? Like if Alex Padilla, a freshman senator from California, is going to say, hey, actually, it kind of seems like there's some things we need to work through here. What does that pertain for Senator Tester, or of course the Cinema Mansion combo. But
Right.
I think that's and you mentioned 60. I think that's relevant as well, right? I think the discourse has gotten so focused around this kind of reconciliation, math that you need a substantial, really a larger chunk on the Senate floor to really move forward, and certainly to actually enact legislation. So I think that's going to be maybe a new calculation that we need to keep an eye on.
That's totally right. The Judiciary Committee is the committee that deals with judges and guns and abortion and all of these, very partisan issues. And so it actually tends to attract, particularly on the Senate side, but also in the House side, the most partisan of members. Moderates don't really want to sit on the judiciary committees because they don't really want to have to vote on all of those things. That doesn't help a Kirsten Sinema. It doesn't help a Tester or a Hickenlooper or Manchin, right? It just doesn't help. These votes don't help them. So I do think it's sort of like, well, what's your plan? And I think, frankly, Congressman Cicilline has sort of seen this on the House side. He passed his bill, was excited to get it out of committee, but frankly, it's encountered resistance from more moderate members of the Democratic caucus in the House. And I think a similar dynamic is very likely in the Senate as well.
So, guys, I'm curious for both of you, I guess, where do we go from here? It sounds like this bill has some work to be done just to appease the Democratic senators on the committee. Never mind, to your last point, the broader caucus. But I don't think it's any secret too, right, that the tech companies have strong opinions on this and are very concerned and are out there being pretty vocal about that. So where do you see this going over the next couple months?
Well, I think it does depend on the strategy of its main sponsor, Senator Klobuchar in the Senate, Congressman Cicilline in the House. Do they try to make changes to address concerns of more moderate members, more moderate Democrats, in order to win enough votes for passage? They would have to make probably fairly significant changes. And Congressman Cicilline in the House has shown no indication that he's willing to do that. Senator Klobuchar, I would be surprised if she wants to, because again, I think part of the premise of her bill is that self-preferencing is a problem and ought to be banned. And if you believe that, then you really you're marching towards mandating pretty invasive product design decisions, right, on the part of Congress. So I think that it's not clear to me. And I think this is a kind of always an interesting question. Like, what is somebody going for? Are they going for the kind of the symbolic win? Hey, I got this bill out of my committee. Or are they going to enact the thing? Because if you're really going to enact the thing, you have to be prepared to make compromises. And members, there aren't a lot of things that start off where a member's really got a really exciting idea, is really excited about it, and then they go march down the path of making that thing maybe a little less bold in order to attract more votes. I haven't seen any indication that Congressman Cicilline is interested in doing that. I would be surprised, candidly, if Senator Klobuchar does that either.
How about on the right? I'm curious. You do have some support. I think it was Cruz, Hawley, obviously Grassley. I believe I may be missing a fourth. Apologies, but color me skeptical as a former Senate guy. But just for the sake of argument, can they find 60 votes with a bigger coalition on the right coming along with some of the Democrats?
I think that is like the $1 trillion question, is whether it is a 30-30 or a whatever 40-20 combination on across partisan lines. I think that when push comes to shove, you heard some pretty substantial concerns. We talked a little bit about some of the kind of definitional concerns and the process concerns. There were also, I think, substantial and valid concerns around national security, around this kind of like prescriptive policymaking. Essentially, we didn't talk too much about the definitions, but you're talking about really a revenue metric. And if you're above a certain, amount of revenue in the U.S., you're subject to these rules or you're not. It's just very, very binary. And I think on that front, there were concerns from the Republicans. There were also, these national security, these data sharing concerns. Now, Brian, maybe what you're really asking is, the question is whether the conflation of some of these like perceived censorship issues, which is a whole, we're going to need to do a separate podcast about why antitrust is not the tool for that, but, and the degree to which it absolutely does not exist, but whether that sort of just anti-tech agita overall gins up enough broader Republican support. I think that's probably an open question, but I think from what you heard from the committee, again, from the kind of the folks that were really, really most engaged on it, my gut would say no. That would really surprise me.
Well, part of my kind of grand theory of tech policy debates right now is that where many politicians start is a shared anxiety about the power of big tech. That's universal between Republicans and Democrats. And then, and so they all agree they want to do something. What I think you saw play out at the meeting last week was, okay, then what happens when you go the next level down, where you actually have a proposal in front of you that does certain things, right? So there's a section of the bill, for example, that is designed to address complaints that Spotify has made against Apple or that Yelp has made against Google, and it bans the big tech platforms from picking winners and losers among what's called similarly situated business users, right? But as Free Press, a left-leaning public interest group, made the point just before the markup that actually could very well be interpreted to prohibit Apple from blocking Apple from kicking off Parler off the App Store, because that would be discriminating against or among similarly situated business users. And in the hearing, you had Ted Cruz actually say he liked that the bill, his read of the bill was that it was actually stopping this kind of big tech censorship against Parler.
Right.
Is that something that Democrats really want to do? I don't think so. So this is where you get kind of the specifics really mattering. And to your point, I think, Brian Elliott, I don't believe party leaders ever want to bring things to the floor that a majority of their own party doesn't support. That's just not good for them. And especially if Chuck Schumer's not going to bring a bill to the floor that his moderates don't support, because his moderates are the people who most face re-election risk this year. So it's just not. It's not the kind of thing that would be brought to the floor with like 30 Democratic votes and 30 Republican votes. That's just not the way the House or the Senate work.
Well, guys, this has been great, and I know this hearing for many probably felt like the culmination of months of efforts, but you've left me convinced that we're still in the first quarter or so here, and would love to have you both come on again. I'm sure there will be plenty of moments over the next couple of months where we can dive deeper into this. Adam, thank you for joining. Your expertise and take on this was tremendously helpful. Elliot, always a pleasure. And thanks to our guests for tuning into another episode of HPS Insights. You can find out more about Hamilton Place Strategies' work in our podcasts at www.hamiltonplacestrategies.com or by following us on Twitter at HPS Insight. We'll include Adam's Twitter handle and the Chamber of Progress website in our show notes as well for folks who want to check out more of his work on this issue and others. Until our next episode, thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Brian DeAngelis.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insights and follow us on the web at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.